Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 edition of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Mr. Andre Gogol. Andre is a visual art and digital media instructor at the Parkland Secondary School in Sydney on Vancouver Island, BC. Andre was born in Calgary. Growing up, he spent much of his childhood visiting his grandparents who lived here in Drumheller, and he loved exploring the hills and coulees of the Drumheller Valley. He has a lifelong connection to the area and was one of the earliest visitors to the Royal Tyrrell Museum when it opened its doors in 1985. Although he eventually moved west to Vancouver Island to pursue his studies at the University of Victoria, his passion for paleontology and the extraordinary landscapes of the Badlands has never left him. He obtained a bachelor's degrees in fine arts and education at UVic and subsequently became a secondary art and digital media teacher in the Saanich School District for the past 23 years. Recently, Andre obtained a master's degree in art education at the University of Victoria, where he explored fossil photography at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, as well as landscape photography in the Drumheller region for his capstone project. Due to their aesthetic beauty and connection with the Royal Tyrrell Museum, several of Andre's photographs are now featured in the Perspectives Gallery here at the museum for those interested in seeing them. Andre's creative experience includes working as a potter and ceramic artist, apprenticing under Walter Dexter, and more recently as a photographer working in a variety of contexts. As an artist, Andre is interested in exploring how contemporary digital photography can be used to create images that are both aesthetically powerful and scientifically relevant. Today, Andre will present an overview of his work on fossil photography here at the museum. So without further delay, it is with great pleasure that I present you Mr. Andre Gogol.
Thank you, Francois. Good morning. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I'll thank everybody properly at the end. I do think it warrants a little bit of explanation on my part for how I ended up here. Francois did a magnificent job, but my history with Drumheller really does go back a long way, and I realize that I'm not the typical speaker in this forum. I'm an art teacher, I do not have a science background, and I'm a high school teacher to boot. So what I'd like to do with my talk today is break it down into three parts. First, why I'm here and how I ended up making this connection. Second, I'd like to look and talk a little bit about how I see photography as a form of data collection, and how, for me at least, that's been quite a different way to view it as a creative medium. The third section for this talk, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what I've done with the images here, what I've done in their making and how I put them together, the different processes that I've used. And I've promised Francois this won't be overly technical, but there are a few slides that show somewhat technical information, and I'm going to make it my goal to break that down in a way that's digestible. Like so many people who fall in love with dinosaurs, this began early in childhood for me. I had the great fortune of having grandparents that lived in the area. My dad's father was actually a miner with Star Mines back in the 50s. My father grew up in the area, graduated from Morin High School. My grandmother was an assistant curator at the Community Museum before the Tyrrell was built. And for me, visiting them from maybe the age of 2, 3 years old onwards was always this wonderful experience of getting out in the hills, crawling around, looking at little pieces of bone and scraps of petrified wood. To me, this was a living experience. Of course, I ended up collecting so many dinosaur books back then. I was very pleased that I still have these. I've managed to pass them on to my daughter, and I loved looking at the illustrations. I was fascinated by how somebody could take these tiny scraps of bone that I would see in person, but then somehow cobble together this information that maybe gives us an inside view of what the animals were like in real life. Now, you'll notice with the image on the right in particular, the the position of T-Rex is something that I can remember thinking, is this quite right? Even as a youngster, I didn't quite understand how it was leaning over top of the Triceratops there. And I was trying to figure out how this would have actually been normal behavior for it. And of course, we've evolved since then to have a better understanding of maybe the position it would be in. But these books served as a fantastic source of imagination for me and were incredibly inspirational. Now, even though I had this very early interest in geology and paleontology, in exploration, I did eventually go the route of creativity and the art path. I was the art kid in high school, so I went off and got my BFA early on. I majored actually in drawing and painting. I didn't necessarily even look at photography. I did take one photography course. I have one background course in analog photography, but I like to joke that I got really good at making mediocre prints from really bad negatives. So it wasn't something that really captivated me in the moment. And admittedly, I did not develop a high level of skill. I eventually went over to ceramics instead. And as Francois said, I had this incredible experience with working with Walter Dexter, who is one of Canada's better known potters. He passed away in 2015. And that experience really taught me a lot about how to think about the creative process. I think of myself as a craftsperson first, not even necessarily as a photographer. And from a craftsperson's point of view, understanding the medium you're working with really is important, not only for health and safety, but you have to understand all of the steps along the way that can result in the final product on the end over there, this copper red plate that I have. I've taken that with me to photography. So in a way, that's what this talk is about, is breaking down the steps and breaking down the connections that each step may have in order to result in the final image. When I started photography, so unfortunately I needed to take a step away from my ceramic background. I was a potter for about 15 years. A back injury after a car accident meant I couldn't really work in the ceramic studio anymore, and I was looking for another creative outlet. For me, I realized I've never owned a good camera. So in 2019, I went and bought one, and I just fell in love with it. I became kind of almost obsessed with learning the processes of digital photography and what possibilities they offered. I recognized right away that it was quite different from analog photography, although of course there are overlaps and commonalities, but I really wanted to understand what you could do with the digital medium specifically that perhaps wasn't available in the analog days. So I tried everything I could think of. These are three examples from my early exploration photography. On the left-hand side over here is just a close-up of an arbutus leaf, and I started looking at macro photography quite early on. Macro photography refers to really close-up, high magnification images that can basically reveal details that our eyes can't see naturally. The center image, I'm very fortunate. I live in an area that has wonderful access to the coastline. Doing long exposures and doing mirrored images is something I've really enjoyed and really was instructive in learning how the different possibilities that are offered by photography can be put together to create kind of fascinating images, or what are the possibilities? How can this behave like a painting perhaps, rather than just documenting a landscape scene somewhere near I live? And then portraiture. I've recruited friends over and over again to pose for me, and I love getting into how can I reveal the character of someone. Now, eventually all of this is going to come together into how I've approached my work with fossils here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, but this is really where I began. I also started with a little foray into sports photography. I was the assistant judo instructor at the Parkland Judo Club for about a 10-year period, one of the many hats I've worn over the years. This is a shot of several of the students practicing, which is something I've enjoyed. Again, looking at what photography can actually offer today is a really fascinating experience, although I haven't continued too much with the sports end of it. For people that are not judoka in the audience, this is looks disastrous. It looks like this could go horribly wrong. I absolutely promise you the young guy getting thrown is 100% safe. If there are judoka in the audience, and I do know we have one, this is not how we teach people to break fall. He's using two hands. He told me afterward that he couldn't remember which one to do, so he decided to actually just go with both. This is not the way we actually instructed them. Shortly after this, when I started thinking about going back to university to pursue higher education at the graduate level, I really wanted to find a way to bring digital photography into a physical realm. As a potter, as somebody that makes actual objects, I loved that final product. I liked being able to say that this thing that was once just a lumpy mold of clay, eventually is formed on the potter's wheel, goes through a kiln, and then emerges with this, wonderful kind of patina from the glazes and the various effects from the atmosphere. I wanted to approach photography in the same way. So some of my earlier explorations were with what's called contact printing. So contact printing is something that has existed since the beginnings of photography. But what's interesting in the digital age is that you can take a negative, almost of any size, and use that directly against a surface that has an emulsion on it that is basically responsive to light, and you can record a permanent image. So on the left-hand side in blue, this is a portrait of my daughter. This is a cyanotype. You might have heard of cyanotype from doing exposures in even elementary school classrooms, where you can take leaves and bits of foliage, put them on a sensitized piece of paper and just let the light do the developing for you. On the right-hand side is what's called platinum palladium, which is basically the same sort of process. It's a UV reactive process, wonderful detail, great range of tonality to it. Unfortunately, it's as expensive as the name implies. Platinum and palladium are actually what's making up the image. I loved exploring it, but I found that my resources were a little bit limited to get into it too deeply. I do want to go back to it at some point, though. So both of these images are from my early experience in my master's program. What I ran into very quickly was the difficulty of, what am I going to shoot? I'd shown up at the university with this enthusiasm for photography, but quite frankly, I didn't have a particular subject in mind. And I found that because our expectations were to stay within the university bounds, which totally makes sense, I was a little bit at odds. What am I going to shoot? Both of these were objects or subjects of convenience. The right-hand object with the collection of bones and these seashells and rocks, these were things that were actually drawing studies from the studios that we were working in. And I decided to start practicing with not only focus stacking, which I'm going to get into in a deeper way, further in the presentation, but with lighting and with these studio kinds of arrangements. So you'll be able to see quite quickly that there's quite a strong connection between the right-hand image and what I've actually done here at the Tyrrell. But this is how it began, was just experimenting and exploring what was possible with what I had at hand. I also started exploring composite photography using Photoshop. And again, I have this really deep and intense interest in seeing what is possible with digital work. This would not be possible in the analog days, for sure. This is a composite of perhaps 50 to 60 photographs. I recruited one of my classmates, my friend, Mr. Tim Malm. Fortunately, he, in his own words, doesn't mind at all being photographed, so he was quite happy to pose for me over and over and over again in these different positions. And then I tried to find out, how could I use the software, which is really incredible today, to create an image that was seamless, that was obviously not a true and accurate representation of life, but that was expressive instead. So trying to go beyond purely documenting a subject to making it expressive was something that I was keenly interested in. Now, what ended up happening was my first summer as a master's student, I spent, as I say, photographing my friends, composing these still lifes in our studio. But very quickly, I had these conversations with my instructors and my professors where they said, well, why are you using these subjects? And I had to be honest, well, they're here. These are things that I can easily access. These are people that are willing to volunteer. I don't have much of a reason beyond this. And I think quite wisely, one of my instructors, Dr. Alison Shields, at one point challenged me, and she said, why don't you work with things that you really care about? What would that be if you could choose a subject that was truly meaningful to you? And quite honestly, the first thought that popped in my head was Drumheller. I've loved it here. Ever since I was a very, very young child, as I say, exploring the hills, I have this very positive connection to the landscape. I have a positive connection with the dinosaurs and the paleontology and the geology that's here. And I thought, well, perhaps I could go back. Maybe I could turn this into my master's project. Very fortunately, I contacted the Tyrrell, explained my situation, and they were very, very gracious in letting me in to take a look at the collections. But I actually started with the landscape photography. I find the landscape fascinating. I think that the potential for creativity, the potential for exploring different views, different times of day, different lighting situations is endless, quite frankly. The next slide here, if you look at the left hand, is actually the same view in a different orientation on the same day. The previous slide with the snowscape and the rivulets of that kind of ice frost that's in the background completely melted away by the evening, and it resulted in this much more colorful, much more intense kind of look, just by the changing of the lighting conditions and the changing of the atmospheric conditions, quite frankly. The image on the right-hand side is also what I would consider a landscape image. Now, it's very close up. It's a piece of quartz that I found that had this wonderful lichen colony growing on top of it, also from the Willow Creek area, though. What I was trying to do was to, in a way, honor my own perception as a youngster. When you're, 3 or 4 years old and you're not quite as tall as you currently are, you see things from a different perspective. And I thought, what a wonderful idea to try and mimic that experience of picking things up and holding them really close to your face that a lot of young kids do. I'm trying to do that with some of my close-ups, some of my macro photography as well. I also went exploring areas that I remember from my youth. This is near an area that I would go camping on my own every once in a while. As I say, I've always loved being in the hills and the coulees, and I discovered this rotten old car that's been shot up several times. great content for my project. I just thought this was wonderful, and I gave it the title Terror of the Anthropocene. To me, there's something very interesting about us as a species. If this is a record of us as an active organism on Earth, that we build these things that are rough on the environment, that are in some ways very destructive, and at the end of their lifespan, we shoot them full of holes just to make sure that they stay dead. I think that this is actually kind of a profound insight into how we behave. Perhaps not on the most positive side, but as a subject for me, I thought this was absolutely wonderful. So, after my landscape photography, I started doing work in the Tyrrell collections, and I was overwhelmed, absolutely amazed at what was here. Thank you to Mr. Tom Courtney for walking me through those, what was possible in those early days, because I quite honestly showed up and said, what would you suggest I go look at? Because this is a completely unknown experience to me. But wonderful specimens were available. These were just a treat to light. What I found is that the specimens were so powerful on their own that it was, in some cases, a real challenge for me to say, well, how can I even add to this? How can I change this in such a way that it's maybe slightly on the expressive side? What am I going to do with my lighting? How am I going to set this up so it's not just a documentary kind of a shot? And sometimes they stayed on that side. Sometimes it's just a really nice reproduction of what the fossil is, how it's been beautifully prepared. And I tried over time to start shifting this into a more expressive direction. With these early examples, so on the left-hand side we have Anomalocaris, on the right-hand side I have these two mandibles that are sitting over top of each other. I was looking for ways to show what I perceive as this dual nature in fossils. To me they're incredibly beautiful, but they're also kind of terrifying in a way. And again, I remember this very strong reaction as a child where I was in awe of these things, but at the same time kind of afraid. There's always been this slightly sinister kind of quality, not only because they have teeth and because they're large and aggressive looking, but also because of what's implied with them disappearing. I've often thought about this in terms of how it reflects on us and how we're fragile, how we are, struggling to stay here on this planet at different points. So trying to get more into this expressive range was interesting for me. I enjoyed working both as a documentary point of view and for opportunities to be expressive. At some point, I also decided to try and tie this into the contact printing I'd been experimenting with. So this is a platinum palladium print. You can actually tell sometimes because of the brushwork around the out-hand side here. So the way the platinum palladium works, you start with a piece of paper that basically is durable underwater. It can be soaked over and over again without falling apart. You apply an emulsion. The contact print, the negative, which is made using usually an inkjet printer, and again, you can do this at any size as long as the resolution of your camera supports it. I'll describe what that means later on. That goes directly against the emulsion and it's exposed to UV light. Well, what it gives you an opportunity to do is play with the borders of how that emulsion is applied. So the brushwork in here is how I laid the emulsion down and then just left it. The edges of the negative actually extend beyond the image that you see. And so the image kind of emerges from this brushwork. I've always been attracted to painting. I use a lot of brushwork in my ceramic work. So this was something that I was quite excited to go back and try and use. But again, because of the cost associated with platinum palladium, I admittedly only produced a few images that I would think of as being complete or having been resolved correctly. It is something that I'd like to get back to in the future. Where things changed for me was when I met Dr. Francois Terrien. Now, Francois has been absolutely so supportive with this project. I noticed Francois in the collections. I was working on photographing one of the specimens, and I could see he was doing the same thing off in the corner. And I asked Tom, well, who's that over there? And what's he doing? And Tom said, oh, that's Dr. Terrien. He's probably working on something for scientific publication. And I looked over and took a quick peek. And they were this beautiful collection of hadrosaur skin impressions, and I was just fascinated by them. So I boldly asked Francois, would you mind if I tried to take photographs of these? I'm absolutely happy to share them with you. If they don't turn out, by all means, ditch them, just erase them from your computer, but I'd really appreciate the opportunity. And he was very gracious and said, absolutely, let's go ahead. So what we did together initially was photograph these close-up, these macro views, as I say, of these absolutely incredible skin impressions. And the goal for this was to reveal the textures, to reveal the edges of things, to show this detail in such a way that you could scan the image with your eye, but see everything in pin-sharp focus all the way through. That's kind of become the main background theme, I guess, to the collection of work that I produced here, is creating images that everything is in focus and you can decide what you would like to look at on your own. I'll describe that a little bit more in detail when we get into the technical part of the presentation. But I just thought these were wonderful images. There's an abstract quality to them that really appeals to me. But at the same time, this is actually showing relevant information. So we're looking at 2 or 3, perhaps, large patches of hadrosaur skin. I believe this became part of a paper by Francois exploring the pattern in scales that was here. And for me, these are just wonderful images with all sorts of abstract kinds of qualities. I look at these as almost being like some sort of a painting, some sort of an abstraction that is just captivating to me. Okay, so that's how I got here. That's the path that I took to actually arrive and say, well, I've been doing this project for, this is the 3rd year now. I've continued past the end of my master's program. My master's program is over, but this has been just such a wonderful experience that I'm very happy to be able to continue. What I think I'd like to do, though, is talk a little bit about how I see photography as a form of data collection. Now, for people with a scientific background in the audience, this will be a no-brainer, so to speak. For me, though, as somebody that's coming from a creative point of view, thinking of this as data was a little bit of a shift, but it's an important one. While I was doing my research, I came across this article, Avoiding Twisted Pixels, which I absolutely love the title, and it had a really profound impact on me. Basically, the argument in the article is that we as photographers, if you're using photography in a scientific context, should be adhering to certain principles, should be looking at the authenticity of the data. This article really got me thinking about what am I actually doing when I hit the trigger, hit the shutter button on my camera. What am I recording? What am I doing with that? How do I interpret this data? Is it something that is only going to exist in a creative sense, or can it be something that also exists in the scientific context? What are the limitations of it in a scientific context? So all of this became something that was in the back of my mind while I started continuing with my project, actually. I highly recommend this, by the way, if anybody has a similar interest in photography. Before I really get into it, though, I think I need to break down some basic terms. This is a list of principles that have absolutely had a major impact on what I've been doing. And again, this is the technical part of the discussion, but I promise I'll try and make it fairly digestible. So resolution. This is something that people talk about a lot, but don't necessarily understand how it impacts a final image, why you would perhaps choose to go with a low resolution image versus a high resolution image. I'll describe that for people that maybe aren't familiar. Number 2 is depth of field, and this is a condition of photography that is omnipresent. Now, for my project, learning how to deal with depth of field and how to approach depth of field has become a main feature. And again, I can describe how that actually works out. Diffraction. It's a small consideration, but it's an important one. And for people that are working with photography in their own scientific work, this is probably going to be quite relevant, because I think I can explain where maybe the limits of data collection end as soon as diffraction kicks in. And again, I have some examples. ISO, which is a condition of your camera. Color spaces, histogram, and raw files. Again, these are all technical examples, but I think the visuals are going to help you a little bit more than me just describing them here. So resolution is something that is constantly being chased in the world of digital photography. If you pay attention to camera sales and if you pay attention to the way that technology is evolving, resolution seems to be this never-ending game where competing companies are always trying to up one each other from, I have a higher resolution camera than you do. But really what it comes down to is the detail you're able to record. The image on the left, which is the fabulous Gorgosaur in the death pose in the main gallery, is very high resolution, and it's actually made up of more than one photograph to pull this off. Probably about 12, if I remember correctly. The resolution that's here allows me to crop in, meaning that I'm focusing on small sections, and you can see how I've descended this from the complete skull to the lower part of the jaw, showing the teeth coming up, and then finally where the resolution does start to fall apart on the far right, you can see that there's this softness to the image. So basically we're coming up against the limits of what is supported by this particular image. Now, resolution is meaningful. If you're thinking about photography as data collection, from my point of view, more resolution is almost inherently better. Less resolution results in the loss of information. So I've tried in all situations to keep the resolution as high as I possibly can for 2 reasons. One, because it allows people to zoom in. If you think about the way that most people understand resolution, that most people would approach this, it's whether or not you can zoom in on a photograph and actually see detail. So this is an example of that process. But what I would say is that this has a much bigger impact on printing. If you're interested in printing an image that has incredible detail up close, resolution is something you absolutely have to pay attention to. And there's a number of technical issues that can interfere with this. So if we're talking about resolution being the equivalent of data collection, you have to understand what's not going to be cooperative if you're seeking the highest resolution images possible. The first one being depth of field. So depth of field is something that photographers use for artistic effect all the time. It's a marvelous natural occurrence from the photographic process. The image on the right-hand side, the left-hand side is from Ucluelet, wonderful area to go visit if you ever have the opportunity. Beautiful landscapes, wonderful coastlines. And this is showing an extended depth of field, meaning that most of the image is in focus. If you look down in the bottom section, though, you can see this, this sort of arc of foliage. It's not in focus either. That's the interesting thing with depth of field, is that you can't really have absolutely everything pin sharp and in focus in a single frame. Not really. There are very rare opportunities where this happens actually. Usually there's going to be a part of the image that is slightly softer. The image on the right-hand side demonstrates this much better, and in this case it's used for artistic effects. So the bee is mostly sharp, but not everywhere. If you take a look at the wing, for example, neither of the wings are particularly detailed. They're slightly out of focus, but the eye is in focus. Part of one of the legs is in focus, parts of the flower in focus, and then it fades off into this kind of mushy, blurry area in the background. So how to navigate depth of field becomes a matter of purpose. If this is being done for artistic effect, depth of field is a wonderful tool. And as a teacher, I'm constantly getting my students to explore how they can manipulate and use depth of field in their work. For me, I was trying to get past depth of field. I was trying to overcome it in many ways because I'm looking to record images that have detail everywhere with almost no loss. Diffraction is one of the other conditions that affects resolution and affects this data gathering. So if depth of field is showing parts of an image in clear focus and clear detail, but not everything, diffraction is something that kicks in by using certain settings on your camera that maybe are working against your intent. That's the way I would put it. Without getting too technical about that, basically, if we look at these two images, this is just an old coin that I had. I thought it would be a nice demonstration of how this works. If you look at the image on the left-hand side, the top left corner of it and the bottom right are both slightly soft and out of focus. And really, there's only this sharp plane that's kind of cutting down through the middle. And hopefully you can see that from where you're sitting. The right-hand image, everything looks nice and clear. Everything is crispy, everything is nice and visible. Oh, this is fantastic. Now the difference here is that I've done what's called stopping the aperture down. Your aperture is basically like the pupil in your eye. The narrower it goes, the more constrictive it gets, the less light it lets in, but the more it extends the depth of field. The problem is when you start looking at these up close. So diffraction, which kicks in around f11 usually on most lenses. And again, I don't want to go into a deep dive of that part, but diffraction is something that starts to happen inherently. It is not something that you can avoid just with your camera. This is something that starts to dramatically affect image quality though. So the right-hand image over there, which is the same as the right hand on the image we just looked at before, just as a reminder, is much softer. It lacks detail. The color is starting to actually be corrupted in some ways. Whereas the image on the right that shows less being in focus is actually much cleaner, but only in a narrow part. So this is eventually going to lead to the discussion about focus stacking, which is something that I've done with a lot of these images, is trying to create a situation where the detail that is recorded is consistent, is sharp, but avoids this softening effect from diffraction. If you're going to stop down your lens, and this is for people that are maybe exploring photography, if you're going to stop down your lens, meaning you're closing down your aperture to a high number, you're inherently going to get this softening effect, this corruption of color, and basically this loss of detail. So diffraction is starting to fight against data collection, if we're thinking of it in those terms. And aesthetically, to me, it's also starting to interfere with resolution. An image with a high level of diffraction is not going to print well. The color is not going to be particularly good. It's not going to have that nice, clean, crisp kind of effect. So it's the enemy of both science and art in this case. Closely tied into this is ISO. Now ISO, for people that maybe have done any work in the film days, was the equivalent of ASA. ASA and ISO are basically the same thing. And in the film days, basically what it meant is you're buying a roll of film that is going to be responsive under different lighting conditions. If you bought ASA 100, you're outside and it's a nice, bright, sunny day. If you brought ASA 400, you're probably shooting in shady conditions, etc., etc. So typically speaking, the higher the number in your ISO or ASA, the lower your image quality, the more grain, the more noise is the way we refer to it, the more is going to start creeping in. And it has a very similar effect to diffraction in that it starts to interfere with color, it starts to interfere with clarity, it starts to interfere with that crispness. In the digital age, what ISO actually is, it's a little bit of a holdover from the way that this was described in analog terms, but ISO is essentially how much electricity is running through the sensor of your camera. Your base ISO is the cleanest. What that means is that basically you're using your camera in a way that is the friendliest. It has the least amount of extra electricity getting pumped through it in order to boost the signal. As your ISO tends to climb up, what happens is that you start to see static. That's the easiest way to describe this. So this image is full of that static. Basically, I intentionally turned the lights down. ISO is usually used in response to the amount of light that's available. In this case, by turning the lights down and then continuing to try and seek a proper exposure, you can see that the image starts to fall apart. It has this grainy kind of a texture. The detail at that macro level is almost essentially gone. And you can imagine if you combined a high ISO with a high level of diffraction, you're going to get a pretty murky image. If you've ever taken a cell phone, all cameras work on these same principles, by the way. So what camera I'm using versus a cell phone is not relevant. It's going to be exactly the same kind of process. But if you've ever used a cell phone in a dark room and you've tried to take a portrait of somebody and then you zoom in and you see that their face looks like this blurry mess, it's probably because of a combination of high levels of diffraction and high ISO just to get enough light in to hit your sensor. So I'm always thinking about how can I keep my ISO low and how can I make diffraction as minimal as possible, if at all. If I can remove diffraction entirely, I choose to do that. Color spaces. So now that we've kind of covered the data collection side of this, the moment where I'm thinking of these considerations that will affect the resolution, that will affect the clarity of the image, color spaces are the next thing, and I just want to touch on this briefly. What we see from digital images is not the same as what we see with our eye. And just accepting this, I think, is an inherent requirement for approaching digital photography in either a creative or a scientific context. This is a graphic that gets used quite frequently to kind of illustrate the effect of how our eyes match up, or in reality do not match up, with what is available in the digital sense. So if you look at the large the oval shape, I guess I would say, without the black outline, that's a theoretical view of what our eyes can see. The triangles are digital spaces. They clearly don't match up. The largest triangle, the ProPhoto RGB, is actually not something that you can have a monitor display. It is beyond our current capability. Now, eventually we might get there where we'll have these incredible monitors that can show something that even extends past, if you notice in the bottom left-hand corner, extends past what our eyes can actually pick up. But really right now, most photographers are working with one of two color spaces, Adobe RGB or sRGB. sRGB is basically the most common color space. If you've ever picked up your phone and looked at an image, which I guess I'm assuming you have, you're looking at an sRGB image 99.99% of the time. Adobe RGB is more of a printer's color space. That's for people that are getting really fussy about certain color ranges, and more particularly in the blue and green kind of range. You do tend to lose more in the blues and greens than you do in other parts of the color spectrum. But we don't have a very big box of crayons to play with. So when I'm looking at these images from a scientific or artistic view, I'm always thinking, I'm not reproducing what my eye can see. I can't. I'm trying my best to show an accurate representation of the specimen, of the subject, but really there are limitations that just inherently have to be acknowledged. Histograms. Now, again, this is a little bit technical, and I'll get off the charts and slides fairly quickly here. A histogram is something that is used for determining your exposure, and this is really helpful in a scientific context. Your camera works in basically a dumb way. If you let your camera take control over how it's going to expose an image, it's trying to find a best possible average. And this is something that is fine for most, casual use, I would say. But if you're looking at photography and if you're looking at it from this point of view of data collection, paying attention to this histogram becomes really important. Basically what this represents, and every camera has this, you can scroll through the menu settings and bring up your histogram just to evaluate an image almost at any time. You can do this in software, in a computer, in post. So this is a very common tool. On the extreme left-hand side, that is representing absolute black. So a loss of image because everything is far too dark to see. So this chart, or this graph of the pixels that are falling in the middle here, that's what the white represents. It represents the collection of pixels that you are seeing inside of your camera and where they fall along the spectrum of light and dark. You can also do color versions of this, by the way. So if those pixels are touching anything on the extreme left, you have a loss of data. Nothing is going to be recorded because the image is entirely black in that section. On the opposite side, on the far right, you're looking at a complete loss of data in terms of it being white. So the way that photographers refer to this is that you're clipping your highlights, or you're clipping your shadows. So the clipping is basically that loss of information. Now again, in a creative sense, sometimes you would want to use absolute black and sometimes you would want to use absolute white. But in a scientific sense, I have to manage this very carefully. So balancing the histogram to make sure that I'm retaining data, not losing anything important, has become, again, one of those focuses that I'm always paying attention to in my work. Just as a quick illustration of how this actually plays out, because this isn't something that is really obvious, I would say, but it's one of the details. And again, coming from a craftsperson's point of view, coming from a potter's point of view, I'm paying attention to the details through the entire process. And I find that if I miss one, two, or even more, the image is not nearly as successful. So these two images, again, going back to that cyanotype portrait of my daughter, the one on the left-hand side is before I've balanced it in post. If you look at the bottom and you see the histogram, you'll see that nothing is actually touching either end. It's not on the extreme dark and it's not on the extreme right. On the right-hand image, which looks better, clearer, the white of the paper is much more consistent, much more accurate, I've stretched the histogram out in post, meaning something that has been done in the computer, to just make sure that the white is disappearing in the paper, but I'm not losing any detail in the face. Again, it's this fine-tuning process, and if you're thinking of it from a creative point of view, quite honestly, these tend to print a lot better. If you're looking at photography to print, using your histogram is almost essential. But from a scientific point of view, it means that you're accounting for the data. You're choosing to retain the data and making sure that nothing gets lost in the process. Okay, the next one, raw files. So this is something that is absolutely amazing with digital photography. This, for somebody that is relatively new to this as a medium, I'm still amazed at what can be done. The raw file is the raw data. That's why they get that name. So a raw file in your camera is actually not an image. It's just the data before it is translated to being an image. This is comparing raw data on the left that has had no adjustments whatsoever. So when this is imported to Lightroom or Capture One or any post-processing software, basically the computer software that allows you to manipulate and change the image or to account for the data, as I like to think about it, the left-hand side has had nothing done to it. This is basically the exposure as it occurred in camera. The image on the right-hand side is me retrieving data that is available in that raw file, but otherwise would not be seen by the camera. What I want to emphasize here is that the one on the left-hand side is not a more accurate image by any stretch. Our eyes do not see this way. If you go walk down to the, but this is a long exposure, so our eyes definitely don't see this way because you're getting this expression of time as well. But if you walk down to the water's edge and you take a look up at the sky, you don't see this blinding bright white sheet, you see blue, because your eyes are going to automatically adjust to see what's actually there. If you look down at the water, you're not going to see this really dark, murky kind of section in your image. You're going to see through the water. Your eyes will adjust to the exposure automatically without you thinking about it. Well, from a photography and creative point of view, I would like to give you access to both of those things at once. So processing raw files and processing in post allows us to control how we see that data and how we can actually express it. Again, from a creative point of view, it just means you get a better looking image, you get a more interesting, rich kind of experience. And from a scientific point of view, it means it allows you to access things that maybe the camera would not have done because of your exposure settings. So this is a really powerful tool. I would say if you have any interest in more serious photography, learning how to manipulate and learning how to work with raw files is essential. I'm not a fan of the everything must get captured as a JPEG in camera experience. That basically means you're letting your camera make all the decisions for you. I don't like that from a creative point of view, and I don't like that from a data collection point of view. Raw files are really the thing that allows you to express what it is you're trying to express and to fit the image to your purpose. Okay, technical section has been done with. And I'm happy to answer more questions if anybody has anything along those lines later on. What I'd like to move into, though, is really the methods that I've used for this project. What different processes have I used? What are all the different considerations? And not necessarily in a technical sense, although focus stacking is somewhat technical, but also in a creative and artistic sense. What am I doing with lighting? How am I approaching this? What are the conditions that I have been able to take advantage of in order to create some of these images? This is the both sides of the view of the young Tyrannosauroid from the stomach contents. I think these are such magnificent views. Lighting them so to bring out all that texture was just a wonderful experience. And then again, being able to show both of them at the same side, that's part of the digital process that we have. This is one of the things that is actually fairly easy, to be able to show two sides of the same thing in a single image is relatively simple. And yet if you went back 20 or 30 years, this would have been a much more involved kind of a process. So focus stacking. Focus stacking is commonly used in product photography. If you've ever looked at an advertisement for sunglasses, an advertisement for shampoo, and you see everything is being pin sharp, from the corner of the glass or the arm of the sunglasses, all the way across the bottle of the shampoo or whatever it is that you're looking at, you're probably looking at a focus stacked image. What this allows you to do is take many images in sequence, combine them into a single image where everything is shown as being sharp all at once. This is how you get past the depth of field issue. Depth of field is something, as I say, that in many cases you can't overcome with a single image. With focus stacking, as long as you're willing to put in the time and put in the requisite number of images, you can create an image that is absolutely pin sharp from front to back. These are just a selection of images from the Hadrosaur skin impressions from earlier on when I was working with Francois. I think I ended up taking maybe 20 or 30 for this particular view. Focus stacking really changes depending on the size of the subject you're working with. This is a quick illustration of how my camera is set up for this. So you'll notice that the camera is on this funny little rail system and then it's attached to the end of a tripod. Basically, when focus stacking, you have two different options. One, you can adjust the focus ring on your lens and literally just continue to focus on different parts of your image by looking through the viewfinder and finely tuning it. Or two, for smaller specimens in particular, you put the camera on what's called a focus rail or a macro rail, and you very closely and very carefully slide it forward. Then, therefore, you're adjusting the plane of focus physically by moving the camera rather than adjusting the elements inside of the lens. This can be very laborious. The macro rail that I'm using can actually be adjusted in as little as 1/50th of a millimeter. I've only done this a few times. It results in several hundred images for a particular view. Some colleagues who are also interested in photography have told me that it takes a special personality to do this. I'm not entirely sure that they're intending that as a compliment, but it is something that I've done several times, for sure. With larger subjects, if you're going to be doing any focus stacking, and this is actually a focus stacked image, it's not necessarily obviously apparent, by the way, in landscape photography. What I was doing with this was using a 100mm lens, which is actually a telephoto focal length, and I focused all the way along the fence posts, going all the way back into the landscape. So if you look at it carefully, it's a little bit different than your typical landscape image. Everything is pin sharp, and that's, again, not the way that we're used to seeing photographs. Our eyes see the world this way, but in photography, usually what we do is we focus on the one thing we want to pay attention to, and that this is the way that the photographer leads the audience through their image, that this is how they point out the things that they think are important. Well, by focus stacking everything in here, this control over where I'm guiding your eye perhaps is lost. But what ends up happening instead is that it mimics more of what I would consider to be a natural viewing experience. I can look at anything in this image and I see just the same amount of detail as if I was standing in this spot. So it's a slightly unusual way to use this technique for landscape photography, but it is possible. With slightly smaller specimens, something in the roughly a meter length, focus stacking is still possible. Sometimes this is unnecessary. It really does depend on the specimen. It really does depend on the subject, the depth of the subject, the topography of the subject. But focus stacking with perhaps 10 individual images still typically results in a higher resolution with cleaner edges, because I basically don't have to stop down the aperture. I don't need to even hint at introducing any of that diffraction. I can find what's considered to be the sweet spot of any particular lens, the moment where it's the most clear, where it has the best optical resolution, and then continue to use that F setting just by adding additional images, getting closer and closer and closer to the subject, and then combining them in post later on. So this has been basically at the heart of my project here, using this focus stacking technique to enhance the resolution of the images and to not give up anything either to diffraction or to ISO. Getting a little bit smaller, so getting into half a meter or less, this tends to now require focus stacking. This hadrosaur skull is particularly deep, I would say, meaning that it has a lot of depth from the back to the front side of it. Something like this, to get, again, this high resolution kind of effect, roughly 15 to 20 different individual frames. And in a situation like this, you can almost choose. If the focus rail is something that actually is as long as the depth of your subject, you could use that to move the camera forward. Or you can adjust the elements inside of the lens. Adjusting the elements inside of the lens is something I would caution you against if you ever want to try this for yourself. At very close distances with wider focal lengths, basically you'll start to introduce some distortion, and the software may or may not handle that particularly well. But again, it is a choice. So focus stacking really can be approached in those two different ways. Getting to smaller specimens, now it requires this focus rail. You're physically needing to move the camera forward in order to extend that depth of field. These are all around the 5 centimeter mark. This is in the main gallery if you get a chance to take a look at it. Beautifully preserved cartilage at the end of these claws on this Confuciornis. I just find these absolutely wonderful, and being able to spend some time with lighting, trying to emphasize the edges of these claws and the shape of them has just been a fantastic experience. But we're getting into 60 to maybe 80, perhaps even more images, just to make sure that everything has been covered in terms of detail and in terms of the focal plane. Even though these are flat, this is still a safer way to actually capture everything in the frame with no loss of detail. Getting really small, down to this ceratopsian tooth. So this is, you'll notice that I have it on the end of my finger over here. This requires a very high level of magnification. And quite frankly, I think this is at the limit of what I could pull off as a private photographer without a large and highly sophisticated studio setup. This is basically what you can do on a tripod that doesn't have a more permanent mounting. So this is 5 times magnification. It uses a lens that does not even have a focus ring to it. It's basically just a large microscope attached to the end of the camera, and you must slide the entire camera forward in order to capture everything. Each view of the ceratopsian tooth is 250 to 300 images, and it's moving the camera forward in a 50th of a millimeter at a time in order to make sure that there's no loss of detail. It's a very tedious process, but what I find really exciting is that by the end, I can actually see this subject, this object, that my eyes cannot detect this. I cannot look at this and see any of the detail that you can see right now. So this is kind of satisfying process of discovery for me. Once I've sat down, I've gone through the process of taking these 300 or so odd images, I put them into the computer, and then this image magically emerges. It's actually kind of a wonderful experience. It's close to what I remember from retrieving pottery from the kiln. You never quite knew how this was going to turn out, and it was always exciting to see how it goes in the end. And I will confess, not every focus stacked image I've ever taken has turned out. I've absolutely missed. Small shifts in the tripod setup can cause problems, changes in lighting, changes in maybe the angle of your subject. There's very, very minute things that can actually dramatically impact whether or not this is going to work out. So this has to be as unstable a situation as you possibly can. If I do any high-level magnification photography at home, I'm on a concrete floor, not on the wood floor on the upper story of our house, just because even a little bit of vibration from somebody walking through the house can absolutely mess this up. Going beyond this, going into 10 times magnification, you really are requiring specialized equipment. The stability that you need exceeds anything that I could do with my more conventional setup. These are two of my favorite images. Working with amber is fascinating, mostly because that moment of discovery is really apparent. Looking at these are both prepared on slides, by the way, but looking on the slide, again, I can't see these details with my naked eye. These wonderful feathers and these beautiful patterns that emerge only happen after the focus stacking process. The other thing that's quite interesting with this is because I'm blasting in a tremendous amount of light, and I'll describe the lighting situation and the setup that I have momentarily, I can't see more than this very thin sheet of color on any individual slide. The effect of this is that I genuinely don't know what I'm going to get as I set up the process, including exposure. What I'm relying on in this situation is actually my histogram. So when I'm setting this up and everything's, the appropriate distance has been established between my camera and my subject, everything is nice and stable, the next thing is to figure out what's the exposure for this. Well, I can't even see the subject. So using my histogram to get this representation of where those pixels will fall is my only tool to really say, yes, indeed, I've set this up correctly, and eventually I'm going to get a properly exposed image. It's challenging. It's an interesting way to work, to essentially be flying blind in a visual medium. But again, I find this an incredibly exciting process because quite often you get to reveal these details that you couldn't see under a microscope, again, because of this depth of field issue. Whereas combining them through focus stacking, and again, these would be around probably 200, 250 images each in order to bring this out. These are around half a centimeter in size, I want to say. It's just a fantastic process from my point of view. Again, looking at more amber that perhaps is not prepared on the slide. This is actually more like a pebble shape from the way I remember it. In person, it looks like a very dark, almost deep kind of red. This was very much experimental. I started focus stacking my way through this, knowing or hoping in a way that I was blasting in enough light that I would eventually be able to capture something emerging from the background, or something that I couldn't see. I knew from the accession number that it was, I believe it was a part of a beetle that was preserved in here. I'm not 100% certain that I've managed to find it. If I look midway through the frame, there's perhaps the suggestion of a wing, or it could just be inclusions and cracks in the amber. It's a little bit difficult to tell. It's quite a compelling image to me, but it was very challenging to actually see what was going on. This is actually the first time that I tried working with amber. A single slide, a single frame on the right, doesn't show very much. And again, this is part of the challenge with this working method, is that you don't get to see what's happening. You just have to trust in the process and then go back to the computer, combine everything, and take a look at whether you've managed to capture anything or not. In this case, I think I've ended up with an image that I'm quite happy with aesthetically, but it's probably missing the actual included insect or part of an insect. Again, I can't really tell what's going on with this particular one. Still happy with this as an image. Okay. Now, lighting is at the heart of all of this. Lighting is the photographer's paintbrush. So for me, bringing lights here and learning how to use them and manipulate them in the most effective way has been actually a beautiful challenge. I typically work with a 3-light setup, more often 2. The lighting in this situation, if you look at the 2 strong lights on the left and right hand sides, they're using a modifier called a softbox. Basically, I'm controlling the quality of light in order to get certain effects. The larger the light, generally speaking, the larger the light that you're working with, the softer the softer the lighting is going to be. And soft versus hard light basically refers to how quickly an image will transition from shadowed areas into highlights. If you take a flashlight, for example, and you shine it on somebody, it tends not to be particularly flattering. They'll have very bright highlights on one part of their face, and the other side is going to be incredibly dark with very little transition in between. Well, with modifiers, you can absolutely control how much or how little of that transition exists in your image. And for the most part, I've been working with very soft lights on these specimens. It tends to reveal data a little bit better. I think the aesthetic effect is a little bit more pleasing, but it does mean that they have to be moved. So the other thing that's been an interesting process here is that many of the specimens can't move very easily on their own, and I've needed to adapt my setup to them. While having a portable system, having a system that is forgiving in terms of what I can do and flexible in terms of the effects that I can create has really been key for this. So again, I've stuck mostly with this 3-light kind of setup, varying that most often with 2, sometimes single light with a reflector. There's a reflector in the front here. If you look down at the center part of the image, that big round disc is basically bouncing light a little bit more onto the beautiful skull of Black Beauty here. And I'm very fussy about fine-tuning these things. I'll often stick things in front of my light to maybe block a little bit if it's hitting too strongly on a part of the subject. Or I'll tilt the light away so I'm just feathering the edge of it just to get a little bit more of a gentler gradation coming across. And this is very much an instinctual process. I do not have a formula that I walk up to any particular specimen and start with a particular approach. I'm finding the best way to light them as I go. And from my creative point of view, this is for revealing character. This is for showing the specimen as something that was once alive rather than this is a dead, lifeless thing that exists in the case. And I'm always trying to find that lifelike kind of appearance in any of the specimens I'm working with. This is one of my favorites. I think that this is where the tension between shooting for aesthetic reasons and shooting for scientific reasons really can come together nicely. This is a scientifically accurate image, although it doesn't have a scale bar, as Francois pointed out, is often needed. The detail in here, though, is very consistent all the way across. This is an image that you can zoom into very, very high levels of magnification and really examine the surface of the fossil if you wanted to. But what I also particularly like is how the shadow is showing the edge of the orbital bone, how the shadow is showing the edge of the mouth, how the teeth show up from this. I love this type of imagery as a child. And really that's what I'm doing, is honoring that inner child when I'm taking these. I constantly have, how would I have reacted to this as a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old in the back of my mind? And seeing them again from that living perspective is a fascinating process. If I can add scientific validity to that, if this is something that is useful in scientific contests, that's fantastic. But I am always prioritizing more of the aesthetic component just because that's part of my background. Lighting is really an interesting tool. And as I've gotten more into specimens that are perhaps just for scientific use, not necessarily for aesthetic appreciation, shall we say, I've realized that lighting can actually be a distorting tool. These are two images of an embryonic skull. The left-hand one is me trying out a certain arrangement of lighting that did not work. And you can see how profoundly different the topography of the specimen looks. On the left-hand side, there are features that look completely different in the upper part of the skull than there are on the right. And that's entirely by the effect of lighting. The exposure is correct in both. There's a bit of a color shift, there's a bit of a color difference, but that's not so important in this case. But the way that lighting is used to correctly reveal, or most accurately reveal, the topography of a surface is very individual. I would argue that this needs to be approached on an individual case per specimen rather than, again, a formula. The right-hand one looks a lot more correct. It's showing the outside edge of the jaw. It's showing the indentations of the lower part of the teeth, not so much on the left-hand side. And all of the features in the upper section really do look profoundly different. So I spend quite a bit of time doing this. If I'm not certain what should be revealed, what is the correct topography in a sense, that's where I'm absolutely consulting with somebody like Francois or Christopher or Caleb and saying, what should I be revealing here? And on several of the specimens, I've had these long conversations where I've been trying to understand what are we trying to actually show, and the lighting really becomes the key. You can use lighting to erase topography, you can use lighting to reveal topography, and again, very much how is the light being used for a specific situation. Post-processing is something that I've had quite a bit of fun with. So this is definitely leaving the scientific range. This is me having fun with a little bit of color. This is what's called a false color or a color swap in Photoshop. Basically, I'm channel swapping, where I'm taking what is red. All digital images are made of RGB, red, green, blue, and I've reversed the blue and red channels. So what was red now becomes blue, and what was blue now becomes red. The green channel is typically left alone, and you get this very interesting contrast in different features that appear on the skull. Now, with a little bit of manipulation, basically what you can do is bring out these different patterns, perhaps if there were different features that were distinct from one another or a little bit difficult to distinguish. This is an interesting technique where you can reveal these. In this case, I'm just doing it for aesthetic effect. What I have a bit of an interest in the future is actually exploring infrared and UV photography, where this technique is inherently very useful because you can absolutely start to separate out details that maybe do not necessarily appear under visible light. So I'm hoping in the future to kind of do a deeper dive into this direction. Composite photography has been a fantastic tool. Both of these are shot in sections. They're shot in pieces. And in some cases, they're actually shot in pieces and focus stacked. Being able to recombine specimens just in the computer has been absolutely fantastic. And the resolution, the detail that's recorded on these is at a very, very high level. This exceeds what you can do with a single camera and a single photograph by itself by a long extent. The left-hand image was shot in, I believe, 3 or 4 parts, and then I've assembled it all, again, using Photoshop or using some post-processing software that's very similar. The right-hand side is the beautiful, I think, very aesthetic image of Blossom. And again, I'm showing both sides of the head at the same time, along with the spine and the hip area. To me, this is again, almost like that abstracted, sculptural kind of an image. There's such an inherent beauty in these things that I'm always impressed or inspired looking at them. I just think that this is a fantastic subject to work with. So I'm so appreciative of my professor for pushing me to work with these subjects. Going back to the platinum palladium, this is one of my final attempts using this particular method, and I decided to try and combine it with, again, what is possible with digital photography. So this is based off of 2 single images of both sides of a mandible. I've arranged them over and over again in this kind of kaleidoscope pattern. Part of the reason for this is that I remember as a child having these sort of vivid nightmarish experiences, while sleeping, where I would see these images of dinosaurs, sort of emerge from the darkness and recede. And again, I was just so captivated by this dual, beauty and terror that they offered, that coming up with some sort of an image that represented that was an interesting challenge as part of my master's project. I'm quite pleased with the way this turned out. I really like the effect of the depth that is created by softening some of the layers of these mandibles that have been arranged as they disappear into the background. The platinum palladium process really suits this well. Unfortunately, this is something that you really have to see in person. They have this sort of strange luminous quality that doesn't translate particularly well in digital. But this is as good as we can get for now. Quite frankly, I have this at home. I haven't done anything with it. I haven't framed it. I actually find it a little too creepy. I find it a little unsettling because it really does remind me of those early childhood experiences. So maybe I was a little too successful for my own good. I can't decide whether I want to frame it yet. Okay, so this will be the last specimen that I describe. It was my project with Black Beauty. So a little bit of background with this. After my first visit in March of 2023, I believe I was looking at the Royal Tyrrell's website, or something came up that made a comment about Black Beauty's skull being returned from being on loan to Japan. And I just thought, oh, what a magnificent subject. I wonder if they'd be willing to let me get in there and maybe even spend a day working with it, just to see what I could do. Again, I didn't know for sure what would be possible, but I love the idea that I could explore and get this chance to work with such an incredible specimen. I was really lucky. I got an entire week. So I got to sit with Black Beauty's skull for an entire week in collections and really think about how I wanted to shoot it. So my initial approach was just photographing it in almost a documentary way, lighting it properly from the side. This is the same lighting setup that I used in the shot where I'm actually part of the image, cleaning up the background. But what bothered me with this, it's a beautiful documentary shot. I'm quite happy with that, but it didn't necessarily have that character. It didn't necessarily have that kind of compelling quality that made me think again of those childhood experiences in my imagination, trying to figure out what this animal would have been like in real life. So I struggled with this because, again, I like this as a shot. I recognize that it was a solid documentary image. This is focus stacked and done as a panorama, so it's a very large image. You could actually print this bigger than life size if you really wanted to, so there's a lot of detail here. But it just didn't, I don't know, it didn't speak to me quite right. So I decided to try and shoot it from the front. And you'll notice that it's a little bit crushed. It has a little bit of deformation, a little bit to say the least, where one side of the skull is maybe pushed in, a little bit more than the other. It's distorted from real life. I looked at it and thought, well, I'll give it a try anyway. So I spent some time focus stacking it front to back, lighting it carefully in what's called a badger lighting setup. That's how I'm getting that dark shadow down the middle. And I also tried 2 different views. Quite often for photographers, if you're doing portraiture, you're very aware of where the level of the camera is in relation to your subject's eye. So being slightly above your subject tends to put them in a less powerful position. Being slightly below tends to do the reverse. And so I was playing with where is Black Beauty's eye line and how should I position my camera to really give it that intimidating kind of presence, which is the way that I would have perceived it, understandably sitting beside it for an entire week. It's a remarkably intimidating object. So I started trying to manipulate it a little bit. And again, I'm trying to think of this in terms of both data collection, aesthetic result, and also what's possible with digital photography specifically. Now, by starting to shift it around, I recognized right away that the scientific accuracy of it is going to change. I'm absolutely changing this from the way it appears in its current state. Francois introduced me to the term Retrodeformation, and I thought, fantastic. That means I'm trying to put it back into a more natural configuration. Maybe what I'm doing isn't just made up after all. I'm actually doing something that is considered legitimate. But this was a challenging prospect for a few reasons. Number one, The manipulation of an image in post tends to create problems. It tends to have effects that are negative on the pixel level. Basically, you're destroying detail. You're starting to stretch some of those pixels. Going back and forth and zooming in very carefully with images like this, you'll start to notice the distortion. Maybe not necessarily from a distance, but really if you spend some time looking at them in a careful way, they start to fall apart in a sense that is not that satisfactory and didn't really match well with the rest of my project in terms of making sure that all this detail had been retained. So what I found was I started patching pieces together. These images are actually made of about 50 to 60 different views. Some of them being focus stacked, some of them being different elevations. Some of them would be me cloning a texture from one side of the jaw to the other side of the jaw. And I was always trying to very carefully massage this into a more natural, lifelike type of position. But it took an awfully long time. I would say that this is probably about 50 hours worth of work. As you see in this slide, I made plenty of mistakes along the way. The mandible does not fuse in the front on theropods, as I found out. And again, coming from an art background, what has been really essential for me is to think of this as a collaboration. I cannot do these things on my own. It's just not possible. So having access to Francois, and Francois being so wonderfully patient with me as I make these various mistakes, and again, slowly manipulating, slowly changing it from point A to point B, trying to repair the damage that had been done, and just spending this time, as I say, the word I like to use is massaging it into the correct form, was a really informative process. Because again, I hadn't necessarily done anything like this, and I was trying to keep at least anatomical accuracy, if not accuracy to its current condition. I knew I was getting very close when in a conversation with Francois, he said, it's getting good, but one eye isn't looking at me yet. So that was the last adjustment I made, was to just very subtly shift one of the orbitals to give it the appearance of looking directly at us. I'm quite happy with the final result. It has that intimidating quality that I remember as a kid. This is genuinely one of my favorite images from this project. And again, a lot of work to actually get it to come together. There is absolutely some photoshopping, which has become a verb, interestingly now, involved in this image. I had to clone pieces from the left-hand side as we see it over to the right. I had to take pieces from one jaw to hide some of the textural deformations that had happened through this process. But I'm very pleased with the final result. It has that character. It has a lifelike quality. It is close to being anatomically representative from the way the animal likely would have been in real life. So this is, to me, all of the things that I had been exploring through my project coming together at once. For my just final thank you to everybody, and please, if your name is not here and I've missed it, I genuinely apologize. This has been a wonderful experience for me. I've been so grateful for the support, the encouragement that the Tyrrell's given me, and for everybody on this list, for everything that has been done. Photographers are always looking for optimal conditions. And I thought this was kind of a nice, excuse me, a nice slide to end on. The lighting coming up from behind the Tyrrell, I'm standing in Midland Park, it's hitting the sagebrush and just getting it to glow with this kind of wonderful quality. Again, I've always loved exploring the landscapes in Drumheller, and I imagine that I will be continuing to shoot this for many years to come. But the optimal conditions are what you're seeking. The conditions here have been fantastic. I do not think this would have been possible without incredible preparation, incredible research from the curators, incredible access given to me by the collections people. This has been really something that, again, would not have been possible on my own, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.